Venezuela exposes a U.S. weakness no one admits. Let me take you back to July 29, 2024, a date that, on the surface, seemed like just another chapter in the long, messy saga of U.S.-Venezuela relations. That was the day the Biden administration announced it would reimpose a full slate of economic sanctions on Venezuela, reversing a brief and half-hearted détente that had allowed a trickle of Venezuelan oil back onto global markets. The official justification? Nicolas Maduro had failed to meet his commitments under the Barbados Agreement, particularly on holding free and fair elections. The media dutifully reported it as a straightforward case of a rogue regime breaking its promises, another instance of the U.S. standing firm on democratic principles in its own backyard. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy geopolitics, Latin American affairs, and U.S. foreign policy, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this moment is far more significant than it appears. What just happened in Venezuela isn't just about Maduro's authoritarianism or the Biden administration's election year posturing. It's the clearest signal yet of a fundamental weakness in American grand strategy, one that Washington refuses to acknowledge, even as the rest of the world has already noticed. Let me explain. The official what they want you to believe. The story the White House and the State Department want you to accept is a familiar one. In October 2023, under intense U.S. pressure, Maduro's government signed the Barbados Agreement, a deal brokered by Norway that promised a path toward competitive elections in exchange for sanctions relief. The U.S. responded by temporarily easing restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector, allowing Chevron and other American firms to resume limited operations. The logic was if Maduro played ball, he'd get economic breathing room; if he didn't, the sanctions would snap back, tightening the noose around his regime. Fast forward to July 2024. The U.S. claims Maduro reneged on his end of the bargain. The opposition's primary winner, Maria Corina Machado, was barred from running. Political prisoners remained in jail. The electoral playing field was anything but level. The Treasury Department's announcement was the United States will not reward Maduro's bad faith with economic concessions. The New York Times and Washington Post ran editorials praising the administration's principled stance, while Republican hawks like Marco Rubio cheered the move as long overdue. The data seems to support the narrative. Venezuela's oil production, which had ticked up slightly under the temporary sanctions relief, was still a shadow of its former self, hovering around 800,000 barrels per day, down from over 3 million in the late 1990s. Inflation, though slightly tamed, remained in the triple digits. The country's GDP per capita had collapsed by more than 75% since 2013. By all measurable indicators, Maduro's rule had been an unmitigated disaster for Venezuela. But here's the problem with this: it's a story about symptoms, not causes. And it completely ignores the geopolitical reality that has made Venezuela the perfect storm for exposing a critical U.S. vulnerability, one that goes far beyond Latin America. Deconstructing the hidden reality. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. First, the idea that the U.S. ever had a realistic chance of forcing Maduro out through sanctions is a fantasy. I've been warning about this for years, but it bears economic sanctions, no matter how crippling, almost never work against regimes that control the levers of power and have no intention of relinquishing them. Look at Cuba, Iran, North Korea, all have endured decades of U.S. pressure without collapsing. Venezuela is no different. The sanctions didn't topple Maduro, they entrenched him. By cutting off the country's access to global financial markets, the U.S. handed him a convenient scapegoat for Venezuela's economic ruin. Every time the situation worsens, he can point to imperialist aggression as the culprit. And guess what? A significant portion of the Venezuelan population, especially the poorest, who bear the brunt of the crisis, believes him. Second, the U.S. claims it wants free elections, but its actions suggest otherwise. The Biden administration's initial sanctions relief in 2023 was never about democracy, it was about oil. The U.S. needed Venezuelan crude to offset the loss of Russian supplies after the Ukraine invasion, and it needed it fast. The problem? Maduro knew this. He played along just enough to get the sanctions eased, then immediately began undermining the opposition. The U.S. response? A half-hearted reimposition of sanctions that does nothing to change the underlying dynamic. If the goal was truly regime change, the U.S. would have gone all into military threats, covert support for opposition factions, a full embargo. Instead, we got a symbolic gesture that changes nothing on the ground. Third, and most importantly, the US has no plan B for Venezuela. This is the real weakness no one in Washington wants to admit. For all the talk of democratic values and human rights, the US has no coherent strategy for what comes in. The opposition is fractured. The military remains loyal to Maduro. The economy is a basket case. And yet, the US keeps doubling down on the same failed approach, as if this time the sanctions will magically work. It's like watching a gambler at a casino who keeps losing but refuses to walk away from the table. But here's where it gets interesting. The real story isn't about Venezuela at all. It's about what Venezuela reveals about the United States' declining ability to shape outcomes in its own hemisphere, let alone the world. The exited geopolitical a multipolar world strikes back. To understand why Venezuela is such a problem for the US, you have to out. We're living in a moment of historic transition, where the unipolar order that defined the post-Cold War era is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The US is still the world's dominant military and economic power, but its ability to impose its will unilaterally is eroding fast. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in why. Let's start with Russia and China. For years, the US has treated Venezuela as its exclusive sphere of influence, a country where it could dictate terms with impunity. But that assumption is no longer valid. Russia and China have spent the last decade systematically undermining US dominance in Latin America, and Venezuela is their crown jewel. Moscow has provided Maduro with military support, including advanced air defense systems and cybersecurity assistance. Beijing has extended billions in loans, invested in Venezuela's oil infrastructure, and, crucially, offered an alternative to the US-dominated financial system. When the US cut Venezuela off from SWIFT, China stepped in with its own payment mechanisms. When the US pressured India and other buyers to stop purchasing Venezuelan oil, China and Russia became the primary offtakers. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for influence in the global South. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as if it can dictate the rules of the international system, but the rest of the world is pushing back. The BRICS action, the de-dollarization trend, the rise of alternative financial institutions, all of these are symptoms of a world that no longer accepts US hegemony as a given. And Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine. Now, I'm not saying the US is powerless. Far from it. But what Venezuela shows is that the US can no longer rely on its traditional tools of coercion to get what it wants. Sanctions? They become a blunt instrument that often backfires. Military threats? They're met with eye rolls in Moscow and Beijing. Diplomatic pressure? It's ignored when other great powers are willing to step in with their own offers. This is the new reality of great power competition. The US is still the strongest player on the board, but it's no longer the only one. And in a multipolar world, the rules of the game have changed. Military and strategic, the illusion of control. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA to the endless war on drugs in Colombia. But Venezuela presents a unique challenge. Unlike Iraq in 2003 or Libya in 2011, Venezuela isn't a weak state with a hollowed-out military. It's a country with a battle-hardened security apparatus, Russian air defense systems, and a population that, despite its suffering, still harbors deep resentment toward the US for decades of interventionism. Any military action against Venezuela would be a nightmare. The country is twice the size of Iraq, with a population of 28 million and a terrain that includes dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling urban areas. The Venezuelan military, though underfunded, is large and well-armed, with Russian and Chinese equipment that could pose a serious challenge to US air superiority. And let's not Venezuela shares a border with Colombia, a US ally, but also with Guyana, where ExxonMobil has made massive oil discoveries that Venezuela has already threatened to seize by force. The hawks in Washington who think a quick surgical strike would solve the problem are delusional. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Libya. The US has a long history of underestimating the costs of regime change, and Venezuela would be no different. Even a limited intervention would risk spiraling into a prolonged insurgency, with Maduro's forces melting into the population and waging a guerrilla war against US and ally troops. And let's not forget the regional backlash. Latin America has spent the last 2 decades trying to move past the era of US military intervention. A US invasion of Venezuela would unite the continent against Washington in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. But here's the US doesn't even need to invade to lose. The mere threat of military action plays right into Maduro's hands. Every time the US rattles its sabers, he can portray himself as a defender of Venezuelan sovereignty against Yankee imperialism. And in a region with a long history of anti-American sentiment, that's a powerful narrative. The real military implication of Venezuela isn't about what the US can do, it's about what it can't do. The US can't force Maduro out without risking a catastrophic war. It can't impose its will through sanctions alone. And it can't count on its traditional allies in Latin America to back a hardline approach. In other words, the US is stuck. The domestic political why this is about more than Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the US domestic politics. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy isn't just about geopolitics. It's about Florida. It's about the 2024 election. And it's about the Democratic Party's desperate attempt to hold on to a key swing state in the face of a resurgent Republican Party. Florida has the largest Venezuelan diaspora in the U.S., with over 300,000 Venezuelan Americans concentrated in Miami-Dade County. This community is overwhelmingly anti-Maduro, and it's a critical voting bloc in a state that could decide the next presidential election. The Biden administration knows this. That's why, in 2023, it granted temporary protected status to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the U.S., a move that was as much about politics as it was about humanitarian relief. It's also why the administration has been so vocal about Maduro's abuses, because it needs to show the Venezuelan American community that it's taking a tough stance. But here's the Venezuelan American community isn't monolithic. While the older generation, which fled Chavismo in the 2000s and 2010s, is staunchly anti-Maduro, younger Venezuelans, many of whom came to the U.S. more recently, are more skeptical of U.S. intervention. They've seen the failures of sanctions. They've seen the chaos of regime change in Iraq and Libya. And they're not convinced that the U.S. has their best interests at heart. This is where the Biden administration's policy gets caught in a bind. If it takes a hardline stance against Maduro, it risks alienating younger Venezuelan Americans who are wary of U.S. intervention. If it eases up on sanctions, it risks losing the older, more hawkish segment of the community. And in a state as closely divided as Florida, even a small shift in the Venezuelan American vote could be the difference between winning and losing. But the domestic political dimension goes deeper than just Florida. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy is also a reflection of the broader struggle within the Democratic Party between the progressive wing, which favors diplomacy and engagement, and the more hawkish establishment, which still clings to the idea that the U.S. can and should impose its will on the world. The result? A policy that tries to please everyone but ends up satisfying no one. Scenario: what comes next? So, where does this leave us? Let's run through the most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the status quo. In this scenario, the U.S. continues its current sanctions on, sanctions off, depending on Maduro's behavior. The opposition remains divided. The economy stays in crisis. Maduro clings to power, but his regime becomes increasingly isolated. Russia and China continue to prop him up, but their support is transactional. They'll keep him afloat as long as it serves their interests, but they won't go to war for him. The U.S. gets nothing it wants, but it avoids a catastrophic failure. This is the muddle-through scenario, and it's the most likely outcome. Scenario 2, a diplomatic breakthrough. In this scenario, the U.S. and Venezuela reach a new agreement, one that goes beyond the Barbados deal. Maybe Maduro allows a semi-competitive election in exchange for full sanctions relief. Maybe the U.S. agrees to a phased withdrawal of its economic restrictions in return for political concessions. This would require a level of diplomatic creativity that the Biden administration has so far lacked, but it's not impossible. The problem? Even if a deal is reached, it would be fragile. Maduro would have every incentive to renege once the sanctions are lifted, and the US would have little leverage to enforce compliance. Scenario 3: Escalation and Crisis. This is the nightmare scenario. The US ramps up pressure, imposing secondary sanctions on countries that do business with Venezuela. Maduro responds by nationalizing US assets, seizing oil fields, or even launching a military provocation against Guyana. The US retaliates with a naval blockade or airstrikes. Russia and China condemn the move, and the crisis spirals into a full-blown great power confrontation. This is the least likely scenario, but it's also the most dangerous. And given the current trajectory of US-Russia and US-China relations, it's not something we can rule out entirely. Grand strategy: the unsustainable burden of liberal hegemony. Now, let's out even further. Because Venezuela isn't just a problem for US policy in Latin America. It's a symptom of a much deeper crisis in American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its unparalleled power to reshape the world in its own image. This has meant promoting democracy, enforcing human rights, and maintaining a global military presence to deter challenges to US dominance. The problem? This strategy is unsustainable. The US is overextended. It has military bases in over 80 countries. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. It's involved in conflicts from the Middle East to Africa to Asia. And yet, despite all this power, it's failing to achieve its objectives. Iraq is a client state of Iran. Afghanistan fell to the Taliban. Libya is a failed state. Syria is a Russian and Iranian playground. And now, Venezuela, once the crown jewel of US influence in Latin America, is slipping into the orbit of America's great power rivals. This isn't a failure of execution. It's a failure of strategy. The US is trying to do too much with too little. It's trying to be the world's policeman, its banker, its democracy promoter, and its energy supplier all at once. And in the process, it's wearing itself out. The alternative? A return to a more restrained, realist foreign policy, one that prioritizes vital national interests over ideological crusades. This doesn't mean isolationism. It means recognizing that the US can't fix every problem in the world, and that trying to do so only makes things worse. Venezuela is the perfect example. The US doesn't need to control Venezuela to protect its interests. It doesn't need to overthrow Maduro to secure its energy supplies. What it needs is a policy that recognizes the limits of American power and focuses on what really preventing Venezuela from becoming a Russian or Chinese military outpost, ensuring that its oil continues to flow to global markets, and supporting the Venezuelan people without making their suffering worse. But that would require something that Washington has lost the ability to admit, that it can't have everything it wants. Alternatives and what the US should do instead. So, what should the US do about Venezuela? Here's my prescription, controversial, but necessary. First, stop pretending that sanctions are a tool for regime change. They're not. They're a tool for containment. The US should use sanctions to limit Maduro's ability to project power, but it should stop deluding itself that they'll force him out. Instead, it should focus on making Venezuela a less attractive partner for Russia and China. That means offering a clear off. If Maduro wants sanctions relief, he needs to verifiably reduce his military cooperation with Moscow and Beijing. No more Russian air defense systems. No more Chinese intelligence sharing. If Maduro wants sanctions relief, he needs to verifiably reduce his military cooperation with Moscow and Beijing. No more Russian air defense systems. No more Chinese intelligence sharing. If he refuses, then the sanctions stay, but the US stops pretending they're a magic wand for regime change and instead treats them as what they a defensive measure to limit Venezuela's ability to become a forward operating base for America's adversaries. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's military ties to Russia and China aren't just symbolic, they're strategically significant. Since 2019, Russia has deployed long-range bombers to Venezuela on at least 3 occasions, including two 160 Blackjacks capable of carrying nuclear weapons. In 2020, the Kremlin sent an advanced S-300 air defense system to bolster Maduro's regime, a move that directly challenged U.S. air superiority in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, China has been quietly extending its footprint, providing Venezuela with drones, cyber surveillance tools, and even helping to modernize its military communications. The PLA's Southern Theater Command, which oversees operations in the South China Sea, has also conducted joint exercises with the Venezuelan Navy, small in scale, but high in symbolic value. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no real answer to this. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute danger, yet when it comes to Latin America, the U.S. is still operating on autopilot, relying on Cold War-era assumptions about influence. The idea that the Monroe Doctrine is still enforceable in the 21st century is a fantasy. Russia and China don't need to invade Venezuela to undermine U.S. interests, they just need to make it a permanent headache, a place where American power is constantly tested but never quite prevails. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The Caribbean is the soft underbelly of the U.S. homeland. It's where 40% of America's seaborne trade passes through, where drug trafficking routes converge, and where a single well-placed Russian or Chinese military asset could complicate U.S. power projection in a crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. was willing to risk nuclear war to prevent Soviet missiles from being stationed 90 miles off Florida. Today, Russia has already deployed advanced air defenses to Venezuela, and the U.S. response? A shrug and more sanctions. This isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader erosion of U.S. deterrence. The message being sent to the world is that America's adversaries can chip away at its sphere of influence without consequence. China is doing the same in the South Pacific, Russia in the Middle East, and both in Africa. The U.S. is so overstretched that it can't even muster a coherent response to these incremental encroachments. And that's how great powers lose, not in a single catastrophic defeat, but through 1,000 small retreats. So what should the U.S. military do? First, it needs to stop treating Latin America as an afterthought. The Southern Command, which oversees U.S. military operations in the region, has a budget smaller than that of the New York Police Department. That's absurd. The U.S. should be investing in persistent surveillance, cyber defenses, and rapid response capabilities to counter Russian and Chinese military activities in the Caribbean. It should also be working with regional partners, Colombia, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, to create a network of bases and intelligence sharing agreements that make it harder for Moscow and Beijing to operate. Second, the U.S. needs to get serious about energy security. Venezuela's oil reserves are the largest in the world, and the U.S. has spent the last decade pretending it doesn't need them. That's a mistake. The U.S. should be engaging with Maduro not to prop him up, but to negotiate a framework where Venezuelan oil flows to global markets in exchange for verifiable limits on military cooperation with Russia and China. This isn't about rewarding a dictator, it's about recognizing that energy markets are a strategic battleground, and the U.S. can't afford to cede them to its adversaries. Finally, the U.S. needs to stop outsourcing its Latin America policy to Miami. The Cuban-American lobby and Venezuelan exile groups have an outsized influence on U.S. policy, and their priorities, regime change at all costs, don't always align with America's national interests. The U.S. should be engaging with the Venezuelan opposition, but it should also be talking to the generals and business elites who keep Maduro in power. Because here's the: Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and the longer the U.S. pretends otherwise, the more leverage it loses. The Venezuela crisis is a symptom of a larger: the U.S. is trying to maintain a global empire with the resources of a republic. It's time to admit that the old playbook isn't working. The U.S. doesn't need to control every country in its hemisphere to be secure. But it does need to recognize that if it doesn't push back against Russian and Chinese encroachment in its own backyard, no one else will. And that's a lesson Washington can't afford to learn the hard way. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about foreign policy missteps, it's about domestic political dysfunction. The Venezuela crisis has become a perfect storm for U.S. polarization, and Washington's inability to handle it reflects deeper fractures in how America governs itself. Let me explain why this matters. First, there's the issue of congressional gridlock. Since 2019, the U.S. has imposed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela, yet not a single major legislative effort has passed to address the root causes of the crisis. The last serious attempt was the 2019 Venezuela Emergency Relief, Democracy Assistance, and Development Act, better known as the Verdad Act, which died in the Senate after passing the House. Why? Because even in a crisis, partisan bickering trumps national security. Republicans accused Democrats of being soft on Maduro, while Democrats accused Republicans of using Venezuela as a wedge issue to rally their base. The result? A policy that's all sticks and no carrots, with no clear endgame. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. political class is more comfortable with performative outrage than actual strategy. Take the 2020 election, when both Trump and Biden used Venezuela as a rhetorical cudgel. Trump called Maduro a Cuban puppet and threatened military action, while Biden accused Trump of being too cozy with dictators. Neither offered a coherent plan beyond sanctions and regime change rhetoric. And when the Biden administration quietly eased some sanctions in 2022, allowing Chevron to resume limited operations in Venezuela, it was met with howls of betrayal from both sides. Republicans called it appeasement, while progressives accused Biden of propping up a tyrant. Lost in the noise was the fact that the move was a pragmatic attempt to stabilize global oil markets after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But pragmatism doesn't win elections. Now, let's talk about the role of the media. The coverage of Venezuela in the U.S. is a case study in how foreign policy gets reduced to domestic culture wars. For years, outlets like Fox News have framed the crisis as a simple morality: Maduro is a socialist villain, and the U.S. must save Venezuela from his clutches. Meanwhile, left-leaning media often portray U.S. policy as imperialist overreach, ignoring the very real ways Russia and China have exploited the situation. The result is a public that's either misinformed or apathetic. A 2023 Pew Research poll found that only 37% of Americans could correctly identify Venezuela as a country in South America, let alone explain its geopolitical significance. That's not just ignorance, it's a failure of leadership. And then there's the elephant in the 2024 election. Venezuela is already shaping up to be a major issue, but not in the way you might think. Trump has signaled that he wants to take a harder line, possibly reinstating the maximum pressure campaign he pursued in his first term. Biden, meanwhile, is caught between his progressive base, which wants to end sanctions, and his national security team, which recognizes that Maduro is a threat. The problem is that neither approach works. Sanctions alone won't topple Maduro, but lifting them without concessions would be political suicide. So what's the alternative? A negotiated settlement, but that requires admitting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, which neither party wants to do. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about how the U.S. handles crises when there's no easy answer. The Cold War had a clear enemy, the War on Terror had a clear mission. But Venezuela? It's a mess of competing interests: energy security, migration, great power competition, and no one in Washington has a coherent plan. The closest thing we've seen was the 2023 Barbados Agreement, where the U.S. offered sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. But when Maduro reneged on his promises, the Biden administration had no plan B. They reimposed some sanctions, but the damage was done. The message to Maduro was the U.S. is all bark and no bite. So where does this leave us? In the short term, we're likely to see more of the half measures, symbolic gestures, and a lot of finger-pointing. The 2024 election will only make things worse, as both parties use Venezuela as a political football. But in the long term, the U.S. has three options. Option: double down on regime change. This is the path of least resistance for politicians, because it allows them to avoid hard choices. But it's also the most dangerous. The last time the U.S. tried to overthrow a Latin American government, Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, it ended in disaster. And let's not forget the Bay of Pigs. The U.S. has a long history of backing coups that backfire, and Venezuela is no different. Maduro isn't just a dictator, he's a survivor. He's outlasted Obama, Trump, and now Biden. If the U.S. keeps pushing for his ouster without a viable alternative, it risks another Cuba, a country that's been under U.S. sanctions for 60 years and is now a Russian and Chinese client state. Option: accept Maduro as a reality and negotiate. This is the pragmatic approach, but it's also the most politically toxic. No U.S. president wants to be seen shaking hands with Maduro, even if it's in America's interest. But here's the U.S. has negotiated with far worse actors. Nixon went to China. Reagan dealt with the Soviets. Even Trump sat down with Kim Jong-un. The difference is that those leaders had something to offer. Maduro does oil, stability, and a chance to counter Russian and Chinese influence. The question is whether the U.S. political system is mature enough to make that deal. Option: disengage. This is the libertarian fantasy: let Venezuela collapse and let the region deal with the fallout. But that's not an option either. Venezuela's crisis has already spilled over into Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, fueling migration and crime. And if the U.S. walks away, Russia and China will fill the void. We've seen this movie before in Syria, in Afghanistan, and it never ends well. The real problem isn't Maduro. It's that the U.S. has no strategy for dealing with a world where its adversaries play by different rules. Russia and China don't care about human rights or democracy. They care about power, and they're willing to make deals with anyone to get it. The U.S., meanwhile, is stuck in a moralistic mindset that treats every negotiation as a reward for bad behavior. That might work in a unipolar world, but we don't live in one anymore. So what's the solution? The U.S. needs to stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue and start treating it as a national security challenge. That means three things. First, the White House needs to take control of the narrative. Right now, Venezuela policy is being driven by a mix of congressional hardliners, Miami lobbyists, and oil executives. That's a recipe for disaster. The president, whoever it is, needs to make the case to the American people that this is about more than just Maduro. It's about energy security, migration, and great power competition. And it's about admitting that the U.S. can't fix Venezuela alone. Second, the U.S. needs to work with its allies. The EU has been more pragmatic on Venezuela, and countries like Brazil and Colombia have real leverage with Maduro. The U.S. should be coordinating with them, not dictating to them. That means sharing intelligence, aligning sanctions, and offering incentives for cooperation. It also means recognizing that Latin America has its own interests, and they don't always align with Washington's. Third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the long game. Maduro isn't going anywhere, and neither is the crisis. The U.S. should be investing in resilience, securing its energy supply, strengthening its borders, and building alliances that can outlast any one administration. That's not sexy, but it's necessary. The Venezuela crisis is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the U.S. can't afford to outsource its foreign policy to domestic politics. It's a warning that great power competition isn't just happening in the South China Sea or Eastern Europe, it's happening in America's backyard. And it's a test of whether the U.S. can adapt to a world where its old playbook no longer works. The question: will Washington learn the lesson, or will it keep pretending that the old rules still apply? Because if there's one thing Venezuela has taught us, it's that denial isn't a strategy. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a policy failure, it's a symptom of a much deeper strategic drift in Washington. The U.S. has spent the last 3 decades operating under the assumption that its unipolar moment would last forever, that economic interdependence would tame revisionist powers, and that the global South would eventually fall in line. Venezuela proves how wrong that assumption was. The crisis didn't emerge overnight, it's the result of a slow-motion collapse of U.S. influence in a region that was once considered an American sphere of influence. And yet, the establishment still acts as if this is just a temporary setback, a blip on the radar that can be fixed with the right mix of sanctions, rhetoric, and regime change fantasies. Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. has 2 broad options in Venezuela, and neither is particularly appealing. The first is to double down on the current approach, tighten sanctions, isolate Maduro, and hope that economic pressure or internal dissent will force him out. The problem? This strategy has been in place since 2017, and it hasn't worked. If anything, it's made things worse. Venezuela's oil production has collapsed from 2.4 million barrels per day in 2015 to just 750,000 today, but Maduro has survived by pivoting to gold, cryptocurrency, and alliances with Russia, China, and Iran. The U.S. Treasury's own data shows that sanctions have cost Venezuela over $100 billion in lost oil revenue, yet the regime remains firmly in power. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis has only deepened, with over 7 million Venezuelans fleeing the country since 2015, many of them ending up in the U.S. or destabilizing neighboring nations like Colombia and Peru. The second option is to swallow hard and negotiate. This is the path that the Biden administration has tiptoed toward, with limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions. In 2023, the U.S. eased some restrictions on Venezuela's oil sector after Maduro's government agreed to hold talks with the opposition and allow a more competitive presidential election. But here's the uncomfortable: negotiations are a gamble, and they require the U.S. to accept outcomes it doesn't like. Maduro isn't going to step aside willingly, and any deal that keeps him in power, even in a diminished capacity, will be spun as a victory for authoritarianism. Worse, it risks emboldening other adversaries, from Nicaragua's Ortega to Cuba's Diaz-Canel, who will see U.S. flexibility as weakness. So where does that leave us? The reality is that the U.S. has already lost the short game in Venezuela. The question now is whether it can still win the long one. And that requires a fundamental shift in how Washington thinks about power, one that goes beyond sanctions and regime change and instead focuses on resilience, deterrence, and strategic patience. First, the U.S. needs to stop treating energy as a political football. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, and its collapse has been a major driver of global price volatility. The U.S. should be working with allies to stabilize global energy markets, not by propping up Maduro, but by investing in alternative supply chains, from Guyana's offshore fields to Brazil's pre-salt reserves. The U.S. also needs to get serious about energy security at home. The shale revolution made America a net exporter of oil, but that doesn't mean it's immune to price shocks. A real strategy would involve strategic petroleum reserves, diversification of refining capacity, and a long-term plan to reduce dependence on volatile regions. Second, the U.S. needs to rebuild its alliances in Latin America not as a hegemon, but as a partner. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and pretending otherwise only alienates countries that Washington needs on its side. Brazil under Lula has been a case study in this. Instead of treating Brazil as a junior partner, the U.S. should be working with it to counterbalance China's influence in the region. That means offering real incentives, like trade deals and infrastructure investment, rather than just lecturing about democracy. The same goes for Colombia, which has been a key U.S. ally but is now grappling with its own internal challenges. The U.S. can't afford to take these relationships for granted. Third, the U.S. needs to prepare for the possibility that Venezuela's crisis will get worse before it gets better. Maduro's grip on power isn't eternal, but his exit, whether through negotiation, coup, or collapse, could trigger a new wave of instability. The U.S. should be working with regional partners to plan for contingencies, from mass migration to potential conflict. That means strengthening border security, investing in humanitarian aid, and ensuring that any transition doesn't devolve into chaos. It also means being realistic about what comes in. Venezuela's opposition is fractured, and even if Maduro falls, there's no guarantee that what replaces him will be stable or democratic. Here's the: none of this is easy, and none of it fits neatly into a 24-hour news cycle or a campaign soundbite. But that's the The U.S. is facing a world where its adversaries play the long game, where its allies have their own agendas, and where its domestic politics often get in the way of sound strategy. Venezuela is just one example of this new reality, but it's a particularly stark one. It's a reminder that the U.S. can't afford to keep treating foreign policy as an afterthought, or worse, as a tool for partisan point scoring. So what's the grand strategy here? It's not about choosing between isolation and intervention. It's about recognizing that the U.S. is no longer the sole superpower, that its influence is contested, and that its policies need to reflect that reality. That means being selective about where and how it engages, building resilience at home, and working with allies to shape outcomes rather than dictating them. It means accepting that some problems don't have quick fixes, and that sometimes the best strategy is to manage a crisis rather than solve it. The Venezuela crisis won't be the last test of this approach. From Haiti to Honduras, from the Sahel to the South China Sea, the U.S. is going to face more challenges that defy its old playbook. The question is whether Washington will learn from its mistakes or keep pretending that the world still works the way it did in 1999. Because if there's one lesson from Venezuela, it's that denial isn't just a river in Egypt. It's a losing strategy.